New developments in the migrant crisis this afternoon. The Adams administration now reducing the amount of time adult asylum seekers can stay in the city's shelters from 60 days to just 30. It's a move that could affect as many as 60,000 migrants currently living in the shelter system.
So what exactly is going to happen?
This change cuts the length of time that migrants are allowed to stay in shelters in half. Now, advocates say this is heartless.
More than 110,000 migrants have passed through New York City since last spring.
This is going to be extremely devastating for our city.
They showed up in droves for a second night in a row.
Migrants have done nothing to anybody. They deserve to have a place to live.
And according to the New York Post, the city has taken in 95,000 asylum seekers so far this year. But 41,000 of those folks have arrived in the last 3.5 months. And that makes New York City the top destination for those seeking asylum in the entire country. And to put this in perspective, over the exact same period of time, 15,000 asylum seekers have come to Houston, Texas, also to Los Angeles, and 11,000 to Miami. So 15, 15, and 11, and here we are, 41,000 over the last 3.5 months. Here's a graph of what this activity looks like. You can see that things now are kind of where they were back in May, and it doesn't really look like it's slowing down.
Places like New York really are at capacity. Yeah, we have large hearts. You want to be generous and supportive to people who are experiencing a humanitarian crisis, but there is a limit to what we can do.
And that right there is why New York City is going to start evicting asylum seekers from the shelter system 30 days after they move in. Critics say this is a lousy idea because asylum seekers who can't yet support themselves, can't get a job legally, might be back out on the streets, and this certainly wasn't what New York City leadership had envisioned when this crisis began in the first place. Here we are at the Roosevelt Hotel. This is the Asylum Intake and Processing Center in Manhattan, New York City. And 60 days ago, the city told everyone that was in this shelter and some of the other ones in town that they were going to have to vacate because the shelters are at capacity. And here we are 60 days later, and that process has started. You see some of the crowd control barriers out in front of the building, and that's because they're expecting potentially lines of people to reapply at the same location that they were staying at to get reapproved for housing. And now that's actually being reduced down to 30-day notices for anybody who arrives after July 31st.
The city now tightening how long migrants will be allowed to stay in city-run shelters in an attempt to cut down on the ballooning cost. Adult migrants, as of Saturday, have to leave after 30 days.
And the reason this is happening is because the city wants to incentivize people to move out of the shelter system if they can and get back on their feet. But again, that's not really possible for everybody.
So, Mayor, the first recipients of that 60-day eviction notice have a deadline of this weekend. What happens to those people?
Well, we were clear they have to reapply, and based on our availability of space, we will allow them back into one of our shelters.
So it sounds like you could reapply and then get placed somewhere else in the system based on what the availability looks like. I know that the Roosevelt Hotel is mainly reserved for families with children, and some of the larger centers like the Floyd Bennett Field or the Randall's Island, those are more designed for single individuals. One of the questions that comes to my mind is, what do you do when the Roosevelt Hotel is at capacity and it's all families? Because right now, this policy of having to leave and then reapply, this does not apply to families. But eventually, the Roosevelt Hotel is going to be at capacity and it's going to be all families. And then what happens? That has to be insanely stressful for everyone who's staying here right now. And critics say kicking people out of the shelter system only to try and have them come back in, maybe to the same place or to another place, is a bad idea because at that moment, they're on the streets, they don't have a place to live, and we already have a homeless crisis and a housing crisis going on here in New York City.
Well, he really likes your content.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Nice to meet you. Take care. Now, whether or not you agree with the way New York City's handling this crisis, you have to remember 41,000 people decided to come here over the last 3 months based on what they thought was going to happen when they got here at the time. And for the first half of the year, city officials went along with the flow of asylum seekers and did their best as people came to the city. Now, whether they're doing a good job or a bad job, that's up to you to decide, but they don't control federal immigration policy, and they were kind of just taking things month by month. But each month this has been going on, things have been getting tougher for the city. They've been running out of money. They used to bus people from the bus station over to the Roosevelt Hotel. Now people have to walk across town with all their belongings. But interestingly, the city has just renewed their contracts with the various hotels that they're working with right here. Over 100 hotels and emergency shelters. They're going to be in contract for housing until August of 2026. And that makes it sound like city officials are preparing to deal with this for the next several years.
This is going to be extremely devastating for our city.
It's a fight to preserve the quality of life of New Yorkers while helping the thousands of migrants who continue to pour in.
What we're witnessing here is a balancing act between the needs of New Yorkers who already live here and those who've just come here and need New York's help to get back on their feet. But the city's running out of money, they're running out of time, and every week more folks are on their way. Now, part of the reason things are so unpredictable here in New York is because the city just got something that they wanted from the federal government, but it could have unintended consequences. Temporary protected status.
This change comes just days after the federal government's extension of temporary protected status, or TPS, for Venezuelans.
This gives people the right to live and work in the United States without worrying about being deported. And it's a humanitarian designation. It applies to people from certain parts of the world where their countries are unsafe and they can't leave the United States. And the benefit of this designation is that if you have it, you can apply for work after 30 days instead of waiting the 6 to 8 months it normally takes to get legal work authorization here in the United States.
Now, Mayor Adams said he spoke to the White House last night shortly after this development. He is pleased with it, but hopes to apply it to tens of thousands of other migrants living in the city.
Now, most of the people in the shelter system cannot provide for themselves. That's why they're there, and city leaders hope that TPS designation that helps people start working sooner will take pressure off the shelter system. If people are able to work and they can provide for themselves, they are less likely to need government assistance. And since new work authorizations can happen in as little as 30 days, that's what the shelter stays are now. Even though it doesn't apply to everybody, that's why the mayor's hope is that eventually it applies to more people.
According to the New York Immigration Coalition, the extended protections will apply to some 60,000 Venezuelans across the state.
In case you're wondering, Afghanistan, Somalia, Ukraine, those are some other countries that are on the TPS list for America. And until more countries get added to the list, some folks are going to be without the ability to start working right away. Which makes me wonder, what happens if you're single, you're in the shelter system, but you can't start working right away? Do you still have to go back out on the streets and reapply? And is this going to encourage more folks to make the journey here and seek asylum as well?
If you're looking at it from a different perspective, some people will not be too happy with this because it may draw in more people over the border.
That's the big question right now. Are more people on the way because the rules have changed? Critics are saying, yes, of course, if you give people the opportunity to live and work in New York City, they're going to take you up on it. But on the other hand, people have been coming here before those were even guaranteed.
Around 472,000 Venezuelans have come into the country. That's nearly 500,000 asylum seekers.
So I checked, and the country of Venezuela has 28.2 million people. And if 470,000 people left, that means 1.6% of their entire population now lives here in the United States. Yes, the policies are changed now, but there's already a lot of folks who are here. Will that increase? I don't think I know the answer to that.
This will help only a fraction of the migrants currently in the city's care. And with 10,000 migrants arriving every month, he claims that the problem is only going to continue.
So the mayor is really between a rock and a hard place on this whole issue. He's elected, he's got voters, but he's also got a really tough situation on his hands with all the folks that are coming here. And New York City's laws guarantee the right to shelter to anybody who needs it on a temporary basis. And the whole TPS legislation victory really only applies to people that are already here. If anybody comes here after, even if they're from Venezuela, they're still gonna wait the whole 6 months. So, you know, the problem is still there. So if temporary protected status were to get granted to everybody who's here in some form or another, it would help people move out of the shelters, and it would probably benefit local businesses who are experiencing a worker shortage. According to this article in Bloomberg, the city of New York has lost 90,000 workers roughly since 2020. And around 100,000 people have passed through New York City looking for asylum in the last year or so. With statistics like that, you can tell why the mayor is pushing so hard for it to apply to everybody. But that hasn't happened yet. So what's the city gonna do? So right now, the city is suing to overturn the right to shelter rules, and this is something that the governor is in favor of. The city's trying to have the right to shelter rules amended so that they only apply to New Yorkers, they don't apply to those who might come here seeking asylum. And if you're not aware, the city's right to shelter rules go back to 1981. That's how old they are, much older than the current problems the city might be facing today. And it's interesting how folks of all political persuasions are now in favor of making changes to New York City's rules. And I think that's because if people come here and the city doesn't have any resources to adequately help them, and you have potentially families out on the streets, that's a bad situation. And look at these images of the Randall's Island shelter. It's just massive tents, beds everywhere. This isn't really designed for families, and this doesn't look like something permanent. I can't imagine spending 6 months in a place like this. And in New York, it gets pretty cold in the wintertime. A massive tent like that might be impossible to operate safely and heat to a temperature where people aren't in real trouble if they're even in there. I don't know. What do you think the city should do? Should they end right to shelter? Should they keep it going? Is there something else that the federal government should do? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next one.